For AP English Language and Composition, today I want to talk to you about the perfect introduction. This is in response to Alfred Green's speech, and this is a rhetorical analysis prompt. Okay, so first I want to remind you that in order to successfully do well in the exam, you will be scored on 3 categories. Thesis, for which you can receive up to 1 point. Evidence and commentary, for which you can receive up to 4 points. And sophistication, for which you can receive up to 1 point. 1 for 1. Now, today I'm just going to talk about the thesis because that is within the introduction. So the key to scoring 1 point in this section is to have an arguable thesis, and that's important. It's something that you can defend, not necessarily something that is perhaps the right thing as you would consider it, or the only way you can argue this, but it's something that you can defend and you attempt to defend throughout the entirety of the essay. Now, to get a 0, you would have to restate the language of the prompt. You would have to almost say verbatim what is in the prompt, or just provide a summary of the text without any clear claim or without any clear direction. But to get a 1, you have to have a thesis that is defendable, right? And it's something that attempts to analyze the writer's rhetorical choices. So what are some examples of 1s? Okay, so here's an example of a 0 first. The purpose and the rhetorical strategies are unexplained. So the writer effectively uses rhetorical strategies to accomplish his purpose. What rhetorical strategies? What is his purpose? Here, the strategies are not explained. So John F. Kennedy uses strategies to convince the nation of his vision to travel to the moon. So I know what the purpose is now, but I don't know what the strategies are, and that's a problem. Here's a summary with no claim. Kennedy speaks to the American people because he believes that going to the moon is important for the nation. I mean, I just summarized the speech, essentially. So these are examples of what a 0 would look like. Now, here are examples of what a 1 would look like. And I try to give you both a below average thesis and an above average thesis. Okay. Lincoln shared his values by establishing a common ground through the use of religious references and repetition of said phrases. Now, I would have to say that this is not an entire introduction. Just remember that what we're looking at here is a snippet of the thesis. So here, I would have to say that the values, the implication is that reiteration of the purpose happened already, previously in the introduction. But telling me that he uses religious references and repetition does give me a sense of devices, which in turn it makes the strategy altogether. Because if he shared his values, these values, this approach of sharing his values, although it's a little unspecified, right? At least there's an overall strategy and there are devices within it, which is important. So this is a below average thesis. What does that mean? That means that the day of the exam, considering what came before this and what the bodies look like after this, it is likely it'll get a 1. Now here's something that would definitely get a 1 the day of the exam. President Lincoln decries the motives and the effects of a few who are unjustifiably forcing the American people to shoulder the weight of economic recovery. He further engraves his position by utilizing charged words in an exasperating style. I mean, you can see the devices and you can see the strategies there. You can also see the overall purpose. It becomes very clear. But in order to make it even more clear, I want to talk to you about a student sample. So here's an introduction. It's very, very extensive. This is not the kind of intro, I would say, that is accomplishable the day of the exam. I think writing something like this under a 40-minute strain is very, very difficult. And the only way you could accomplish it is if A, you're a phenomenal writer, or B, you make the body paragraphs suffer by not giving them enough attention. Or you make another essay, let's say, suffer if you borrow time into the rhetorical. But this is definitely something that is way beyond what is expected. But because it is beyond what is expected, it becomes a great example of all the many things you could do. Okay. Calling for unity with the Union under the crossfires of a national separation, Alfred M. Green directs a rallying cry to those who tempt a future of freedom by participating in the burgeoning American Civil War. In 1861's Philadelphia, Green addresses the exploited bodies and wounded pride of African Americans, urging them not to dwell on their country's oppressive past, but to take up arms for the side that promises them a liberated tomorrow. He solicits African American support for the Union by illustrating the greatness of their country's past and to inspire present action, assuring them that participation in the war is their only means to liberty. Alluding to America's noble foundations, Green ignites the flames of patriotism in their hearts through pathetic appeals while decrying the sinister intentions of the Confederacy to logically posit that a victory for the Union is a victory for African Americans. Okay, what works about this introduction? Well, all the elements are there. You provide context, speaker, situation, audience, the main idea of the text, you identify the purpose of the text, and you present devices and strategies. And these are the most important things in an introduction. This is what makes an introduction. And you need it, I would argue, in this order. Begin with a context, be it speaker and audience, situation. Sometimes you can forego one of these if it doesn't specify what the audience is. Establish the main idea of the text, sort of like a brief, very brief, half a sentence length at most, summary. Identify the purpose of the text, which is the intent of the writer, and then give the devices and strategies that help the writer prove that thing or convince you of that other thing. So here are some of the things that I liked about this introduction. Look at the context, the audience, and main idea. It's pretty specific, right? So what's happening here according to, what can I gather from this introduction about the speech? Well, the crossfires of national separation, the burgeoning American Civil War. Alfred M. Green is the speaker. It happens in 1861, right? Like, I'm getting a lot of information about the context. I also know something about the audience too. I know that he's addressing the exploited bodies and wounded pride of African Americans. The writer here doesn't just say that Alfred M. Green is writing to African Americans, right? But the exploited bodies, the wounded pride, right? I also get a sense of the main idea of the text, especially right here, directing a rallying cry to those who tempt a future of freedom by participating in the Civil War. There's an idea of what it is that this text is overall about, and that's important for to identify in the introduction. Now, the purpose is very much explicit, not only made explicit once, but also repeated throughout the text, which I think is very important. You don't just want to say the purpose one time. If you're able to reinvent yourself a few times and to reiterate what the purpose is from different angles, that's really important. Urging them not to dwell on the country's oppressive past, but to take up arms for the side that promises them a liberated tomorrow. He solicits African American support for the Union. Green ignites the flames of patriotism. I think the ability that this student writer has to be able to reiterate the purpose more than once it's incredible, really. Now, what else happens in this introduction? A good introduction doesn't only talk about rhetorical choices, about devices and strategies. A good introduction appropriates them, becomes them. So this writer uses her own appeals, right? There is a sprinkle of ethos, pathos, and logos. Look at the pathos here. She characterizes African Americans as exploited bodies and wounded pride. And then later she calls pathetic appeals, which I don't necessarily think that this is the best phrasing, but I think the attempt is there. Now, the ethos, for instance, the greatness of their country's past, America's noble foundations. I mean, she's alluding to the shared belief that the African Americans and the people of the time had for their own country, right? And then the last one, logos, she points out that Green's speech assures them that participation in the war is their only means to liberty. I mean, that's a pretty logical trade that she's able to pick up on. And later on, logically posit that a victory for the Union is a victory for African Americans. It's the way she's able to echo her own ideas and to use different phrasing every time. Take, for instance, the verbs that she uses, primarily verbs in ing. Now, why is the present progressive here so important? They signal analysis every time. And she's able to elongate her sentences and actually get more out of each sentence, out of each device, out of each comment, simply because she's elongating them through present progressive verbs. So calling for unity by participating. Look how often she elongates her sentences and gets to make an analytical point. Not only that, but verbs altogether. This entire introduction is riddled with verbs. And that's important. Without a verb, you have no sentence. And without a verb, you have no point. You have no argument, especially in argumentation, because that's what a rhetorical analysis is at the core. you are arguing what the argument of the writer is, and then you're demonstrating how he argued that, basically. So having a lot of verbs is a good way of assuring that your introduction is always making a claim, always making a point. Now, there are also interesting phrases that I think make the writing more attractive altogether. The crossfires of national separation, tempt the future of freedom, exploited bodies and wounded pride, decide the promises of a liberated tomorrow, America's noble foundations, flames of patriotism, sinister intentions. I mean, these are phrases that the writer, the student writer here, is able to communicate through these phrases that she understands deeply what is happening in the text, so much so that she can characterize it in her own way. There is a comprehensive, very comprehensive thesis right here, which I'm going to break up in a second into devices and strategies. So the thesis altogether, that's how long it takes. Must the thesis take that long to get a point? No. But this way, not only does she get a point for thesis or a point for the introduction, but she also is setting herself up for sophistication, the sophistication point later on. So look at the devices and strategies, the way she breaks them up, right? The device would be the what. He solicits African American support for the Union. How is he doing that? By illustrating the greatness of their country's past to inspire present action. This one would be, here the device is the illustration of the past. And it's also an appeal to ethos. Why? Because it assures them that participation in the war is their only means to liberty. So all three are highlighted here. But later when you see the second portion of the thesis, she switches it up, right? So instead of what, how, and why, now it's how, what, and why. So alluding to America's noble foundations through pathetic appeals, green ignites, which is the main purpose or claim being made here, the flames of patriotism in the hearts. Why? Because this way it logically posits that a victory for the Union is a victory for African Americans. So I think overall what makes an introduction work is all of these elements. And if you're able to end your introduction in a way that is very smooth, and it definitely takes you into the body conversation, I think that adds something, some elevated element to your introduction altogether that makes you seem more appealing to your own reader. And this is definitely a good way to end an intro, to wrap it up. So many intros feel truncated, like they were gone before their time. So a victory for the Union is a victory for African Americans. It's a nice little sentiment that captures essentially what most of the text is about.